Hello, I'm Juliet Hess, and I'm going to be talking about internalized ableism today. I want to start with a land acknowledgement for the land that I'm currently residing on. We collectively acknowledge that Michigan State University occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. In particular, the university resides on land ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. We recognize, support, and advocate for the sovereignty of Michigan's 12 federally recognized Indian nations, for historic Indigenous communities in Michigan, for Indigenous communities, individuals and communities who live here now, and for those who were forcibly removed from their homelands. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold Michigan State University more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. I want to be clear that in offering this land acknowledgement, I do not intend for this to be a performative act, but rather to demonstrate a commitment to holding Michigan State University more accountable and to doing work towards Indigenous sovereignty. So I'm honored to have been invited to give a keynote address at a conference that I am deeply invested in and that consistently lives up to its values. I had a number of ideas about topics to discuss and ultimately settled on trying to work through something that I'm really struggling with and have been for a long time at this point: internalized ableism. I hope that using this opportunity to work through something challenging for me personally will offer considerations to those of you who are similarly grappling. I also appreciate the opportunity to submit a video as my health keeps deteriorating and I'm going on medical leave shortly. I am recording this on December 2nd, 2024. In August 2023, it became progressively harder to walk. The 2 miles I had walked every day of my adult life became impossible, and my walks became me struggling for 0.2 of a mile, literally dragging my body to the stop sign a block away and back. I was also overheating without any exertion at all, which now included trying to stand up, and became winded constantly. That fall, I also became chronically hunched over when I tried to stand or walk. After what has now been 13 months of waiting months at a time for each doctor's appointment, I still do not have any answers as to what is going on with my body. One of the things that has been the hardest has not been what I'm experiencing, but what I perceive that I look like to others when I stagger the 300 steps from my parking spot to my building, bent over at almost 90 degrees, or walk across the classroom to check on a group of students working on a task. Somehow, I have internalized that it is not okay to look the way that I do, to have an unruly body. About 6 months ago, I realized that I have been told to stand up straight since I was about 3 years old, and I literally can't. Even though it seriously disturbs me, I see my inability to stand up straight as a personal failing, and it shocked me to realize that I identified this failing as moral in nature. Me, the person who routinely engages with disability in my work and has taught disability studies at Michigan State University since 2019, somehow still believes that my unruly body is unacceptable. These feelings are ugly. They are embarrassing, and I am ashamed that I feel that way when I am deeply embedded in disability studies, and I know better. The fact that I feel this way, however, has taught me exactly how deep ableism goes. I therefore want to tease out the dynamics that contribute to internalized ableism in the hopes that disabled folks, as well as the temporarily able-bodied folks who will one day become disabled, will be able to love our disabled bodies unconditionally. I have learned that no amount of being embedded in disability studies prepares a person for the internalized ableism of having these kinds of embodied changes. I also know that a disability is inevitable for those of us who have the privilege of aging. We are, at most, temporarily able-bodied, so grappling with the complexities of disability is inevitable. My approach to my own body would greatly benefit from losing the internalized ableism. In this paper, I therefore think through what I believe are the key factors that impact the fostering of internalized ableism, as well as possibilities for mitigating this internalized form of oppression, including in and through music education. I begin by defining my terms and then consider the ways that society conditions individuals to think about disability by elaborating the different facets of socialization that contribute to the discourse. I subsequently grapple with neoliberalism and its imperative of productivity on socialization and the effect of such an imperative on this conversation. The societal default, I argue, is that of exclusion, which compels a drive toward the so-called normative. To make this case, I historicize legal exclusions and engage with Foucault's famous work on biopower, alongside a politics of disposability as they relate to disability. I also grapple with eugenics. These preceding factors all contribute to the internalization of ableism. Ultimately, I consider what it might mean to unlearn some of these tendencies toward exclusion, shame, and ableism, and engage with a possible role for music education. I conclude with a call to action, activism. I begin by defining my terms, drawing on Fiona Kumari Campbell's often cited definition of ableism. Campbell argued that ableism constitutes a network of beliefs, processes, and practices that produces a particular kind of self and body, the corporeal standard, that is projected as the perfect, species-typical, and therefore essential and fully human. Disability is cast as a diminished state of being human. In the case of ableism, the disabled body is held unfavorably against a perfect species typical, which constitutes the measure of what it means to be fully human. When able-bodied becomes the measure of humanity, disabled bodies then become relegated to subhumanity. Internalized ableism then is the internalization of this powerful ableist message of less than. In other words, because I do not measure up to the corporeal standard, I understand myself as somehow less valuable and less human. I now wish to take a step back and consider the larger picture. What does society socialize us to believe about disability? What representations are most prominent? How do these socialization processes and representation formulate our personal ideas about disability that may lead to the kind of internalized ableism that I am currently experiencing? I discuss three narratives that prominently shape the social imaginary about disability: inspiration porn, the so-called supercrip, and the narrative of success in spite of disability. I have elaborated the contributions of inspiration porn and the supercrip narrative to the social imaginary elsewhere, so explain briefly here. The term inspiration porn was popularized by Stella Young, disability rights activist, journalist, and comedian, in her 2012 article and her 2014 TED Talk. Young focused on representations of disability that she believed made disabled people into objects of inspiration. For example, in her 2012 article, she includes an image of a little girl running with prosthetic legs alongside runner Oscar Pistorius, who also uses prosthesis. The caption on the picture reads, "The only disability in life is a bad attitude." Young eviscerates this quote from figure skater and cancer survivor Scott Hamilton in her 2014 TED Talk, noting that no amount of smiling at a flight of stairs has ever made it turn into a ramp. She categorizes this type of image, so prevalent in the public sphere, as inspiration porn. She notes, inspiration porn is an image of a person with a disability, often a kid, doing something completely ordinary, like playing or talking or running or drawing a picture or hitting a tennis ball, carrying a caption like, "Your excuse is invalid," or "Before you quit, try." Increasingly, they feature the Hamilton quote. Young elaborates her use of the word porn. She says, I use the term porn deliberately because they objectify one group of people for the benefit of another group of people. So in this case, we're objectifying disabled people for the benefit of non-disabled people. The purpose of these images is to inspire you, to motivate you, so that we can look at them and think, well, however bad my life is, it could be worse. I could be that person. Objectification, then, is key to inspiration porn. These images allow non-disabled people to engage in what has been called downward comparison. Downward comparison elicits feelings of superiority among non-disabled people in comparison with their disabled peers. I have also suggested that the narrative of the supercrip strongly shapes the social imaginary around disability, and I review this argument here. Sami Schalk, who has done extensive work on this narrative, dates the first usage of the term to the mid to late 1970s. Originally intended as a pejorative for so-called overachieving disabled people, the term supercrip has been used to describe disabled folks who inspire through either doing the mundane or the extraordinary. Silva and Howe elaborate three elements of the supercrip narrative as it operates in the public sphere. 1, the use of superlative language. 2, a medicalized or scientific analysis of the body. And 3, comparison with the non-disabled norm. Discourses of overcoming or success heavily feature in the descriptions of the supercrip. Supercrips defy the odds of their disability and accomplish the impossible. Another prominent narrative in the social imaginary is that of success in spite of disability. What Campbell calls the emerging counterstory of the disability survivor obscures and prevents the exploration of the personal costs of disability subordination and normalization. For Campbell, disability success stories are often based on the notion of success in spite of impairment, which is profoundly different to stories that embrace impairment and are based on the notions of success because of disability, or stories about living with ableism. These narratives of success in spite of disability resonate with the imagery propagated by inspiration porn and the supercrip narrative, as these two also feature images of success in spite of disability, whether they feature disabled folks doing the mundane or the extraordinary. How, then, might these representations of disability so prominent in the social imaginary result in the kind of internalized ableism I and others so regularly experience? Campbell makes a compelling comparison to racial oppression, particularly when and as it is internalized by racialized folks. Drawing on Koval, who describes internalized racism, Campbell notes that the accumulation of negative images presents racial minorities with one massive and destructive choice, either to hate oneself as culture so systemically demands, or to have no self at all, to be nothing. These negative images strongly shape how both disabled and non-disabled people come to understand how society considers and excludes disability. These representations and narratives are harmful and often explicitly serve a role for non-disabled people to engage in downward comparison, thereby understanding themselves as superior to disabled people. Disability is continually portrayed as deficit, pejorative, obstacle, and impediment. Campbell's comparison to internalized racism urges the consideration of the way this barrage of negative energy is difficult to resist, even for disabled people ourselves. These representations aim to inspire the non-disabled public and aim to provoke awe, tragedy, triumph, and pity, all fodder for everyone to internalize about disability. Beyond these elements that shape socialization about disability, neoliberalism and capitalism also impact the way that disabled folks understand our value. Neoliberalism, broadly, configures all aspects of existence in economic terms. Bodies, then, including disabled bodies, derive their value under neoliberalism and capitalism from what we produce. While it is well established that academia is steeped in neoliberalism, particularly in its demand for obscene levels of productivity, this emphasis on productivity permeates society at large. Under neoliberalism, bodies only have value based on what we contribute. Moreover, in the context of academia, the pressure on bodies extends well beyond productivity to hyperproductivity at the complete expense of the body-mind. The neoliberal emphasis on both productivity and hyperproductivity as indicators of personal value may easily be internalized by disabled folks who may have physical, emotional, and otherwise embodied restrictions on what kind of productivity is possible for our bodies. This challenge becomes more complicated when considering the other aspects of socialization described previously, particularly the imagery or representation that celebrates disabled folks for doing the mundane. The neoliberal economy leaves no room for aspects of existence that cannot be configured economically. This pressure to produce, then, potentially in the face of being unable to meet these impossible standards, may also be internalized by disabled folks as an individual failure. In considering the possibility of internalized ableism, disabled folks may well interpret our inability to meet these expectations of hyperproductivity as a measure of our value, or lack thereof, in a monetized and economized environment. In considering the internalization of ableism, it also becomes important to consider exclusion as the societal default in relation to disability. I specifically consider the US context, but note that similar moves also occurred elsewhere. In this section, I briefly historicize exclusion through the law, engage with Foucauldian notions of biopower in relation to disability, and consider the remnants of strong eugenics movements. This powerful impulse toward exclusion, or elimination, may also contribute to negative perceptions of disability both in the self and in others. While each of these topics deserves book treatment, and indeed has received it, for this paper, I briefly explain how they contribute to powerful negative perceptions. First, exclusion is historical. I begin by considering what have commonly been referred to as the ugly laws in the US. These ugly laws criminalized being disabled in public and particularly targeted any begging, which was strongly linked to disability. The Chicago City Code of 1881 passed the following ordinance, for example. Any person who is diseased, maimed, mutilated, or in any way deformed, so as to be an unsightly or disgusting object or an improper person to be allowed in or on the streets, highways, thoroughfares, or public places in the city, shall not therein or thereon expose himself to public view under the penalty of a fine of $1 for each offense. Schweik noted that that would be about $20 in 2009. Such laws were passed nationally all over the US in different cities and also made their way into countries colonized by US imperialism. While the majority of these laws have been repealed, this mindset still pervades encounters with disability today. Like many of the movements that followed, this criminalization of being disabled in public also significantly limited public, non-disabled encounters with disabled folks. Both historically and presently, exclusion has often been the default position on disability, and this stance was reified legally for over a century. Second, Foucault theorized what he referred to as biopower or biopolitics to explore the differential value ascribed to bodies and the marking of some individuals and groups as disposable, and particularly targeted bodies that deviated from the dictated norm. We are currently witnessing the mass genocide of the Palestinian people. a brutal example of the way that some bodies are denied humanity and therefore become marked as disposable. Such examples have long occurred in the US and include the physical and cultural genocide of indigenous populations, and also examples such as Hurricane Katrina. We have seen such determinations of who and who is not worthy of aid over and over in the years that followed Katrina. In the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, the virus disproportionately affected minoritized and multiply minoritized populations, pointing to strong intersections between race and disability. Biopower reinscribes the notion that some bodies are worthy of life and care, while others are left to die. One such example is the case of selective abortion, or the abortion of fetuses that have been identified as disabled. This issue has a long history of opposition from the disabled community and moves into the territory of eugenics, a movement that intersects strongly with the way that Foucault has theorized biopower and biopolitics. Eugenics, broadly, aims to improve the gene pool of the population through eliminating what eugenicists consider inferior populations. Those deemed inferior include disabled folks, racialized folks, and other minoritized and multiply minoritized groups. The specter of eugenics also looms over current government threats to the so-called social safety net in the United States. Cuts and the possible elimination of disability benefits, Medicaid, food stamps, etc., will adversely affect disabled folks across identities who are also overrepresented among people experiencing poverty. While these cuts differ in nature from active decisions about life or death of disabled people, they nonetheless mark these populations disposable and will most certainly result in death for some explicitly because of the possible withdrawal of support. These various historical and current movements and approaches to disability all reinscribe disability as negative and go so far as to mark disabled people as unworthy of life in some cases. The various ways that biopower and biopolitics manifest ultimately mostly function to mark disabled people as disposable and, at best, included when engaging in disavowal of some kind. These movements, too, contribute to the socialization of disabled people to be prone to internalizing such messages, but also perpetrate laws, policies, and overt discourses that communicate the lack of value inherent in a disabled body. Given the long-standing presence of the ugly laws and eugenics movements, it becomes quite difficult not to internalize the continual devaluing and, in some cases, disposal of disabled bodies as a disabled person. Given these multifaceted processes of socialization that touch almost every aspect of the consideration of disability, what might a process of unlearning these negative messages involve? Campbell suggests that the use of counterstory may be appropriate. She opines, is it possible to imagine disability outside the context of tragedy or catastrophe? Compulsory ableness shapes our imaginations as to the forms of perfected bodies and the kinds of mental and emotional capacities that are valued. A chief feature of an ableist viewpoint is a belief that impairment, irrespective of type, is inherently negative and should, if the opportunity presents itself, be ameliorated, cured, or, indeed, eliminated. What remains unspeakable are imaginations of impairment as an animating, affirmative modality of a subjectivity. Can we imagine great beauty in disability, or are we affronted by such a thought? Counterstory or counterstory telling is a strategy and core tenet of critical race theory, CRT. In the context of CRT, counterstories aim to foreground the stories and experiences of minoritized voices to unsettle dominant narratives. These dominant narratives, or majoritarian stories, are stories shared by dominant group members that offer narratives of shared experiences among dominant group members. Such stories ultimately serve to both naturalize and reinscribe group dominance. Counter stories, conversely, aim to interrupt this reality. They do so by centering voices from the margins that often work to challenge and unsettle dominant narratives. Campbell, for example, challenges the typical disability success stories. She observed, normally, these stories are based on the notion of success in spite of impairment, which is profoundly different to stories that embrace impairment and are based on the notion of success because of disability, or stories about living with ableism. Engaging counter storytelling in the unlearning process then involves considering the centrality of disability to the story rather than its separation from the achievement, coupled with imaginations of impairment such as an animating affirmative modality of subjectivity. In telling such stories, let us work to reveal the great beauty in disability and aim to unsettle dominant narratives of tragedy or catastrophe. Positioning such counter stories in prominent mechanisms for sharing may begin the process of unsettling the veritable avalanche of negative socializations about disability and perhaps offers the seed to unlearning the kinds of narratives that I, alongside other disabled folks, simply inhale by being a part of a neoliberal, oppressive, and capitalistic society. Rather than telling stories in spite of disability, we can purposefully share narratives that describe success because of disability, with disability, and disability. Any kind of substantive change requires encounters with stories that resist dominant narratives, which results in dominant messaging and socialization processes being part of, but not the whole story. As a music educator, I often find myself frustrated with music education and the demand to make the connection to music education. I also, however, understand that music education is my corner of the world and that I am committed to making music education live up to its purported mythology of inclusion, a word and concept I dislike for its intrinsic exclusion. Despite my misgivings, I believe that this discussion matters greatly for music education for reasons both related to identity and to pedagogical approach. This section addresses both. In terms of identity, disability is inevitable. A person who identifies as able-bodied is likely only temporarily able-bodied. If we live long enough, we become disabled, and some of us hold disability and neurodivergent identities sooner than others. This discussion, then, is imperative for music education precisely because of the inevitability of disability. My internalized ableism shocked me, given my immersion in disability and mad studies. The thoughts that I had about my body not only were not helpful, but were actually destructive. I do not wish others to experience the same kind of internalized ableism when they become disabled, and this wish includes those also situated in music education. Moreover, when we choose to educate ourselves about ableism and the potential of internalizing it, we can support disabled students to come to consciousness about this form of oppression and reverse any negative self-talk internalized by different facets of socialization. As music educators, we can also resist the deficit discourses that pervade discussions of disability in both music education and education. In terms of pedagogy, music educators might engage in several important moves. Unfortunately, despite years of efforts to the contrary, exclusion remains the default in music education across most minoritized identities. While ableism has received less scholarly attention than oppressions associated with other sites of identity, it nonetheless pervades the field. Tobin Siebers theorized an ideology of ability in 2008, which underscored a basic preference for being able-bodied and able-minded. This fundamental preference has led to ableism in the world writ large and also in music education, where it thrives. Over a decade ago, Terrell Dobbs examined articles published on disability in the Journal of Research in Music Education, JRME, and conducted a discourse analysis to reveal disturbing themes. She observed three discourses that dominated the literature on disability in music education. A, disability deserves particularistic and deep disclosure. B, disability is an embodied functional deficit. And C, a hegemony of normativity is inscribed via systemic ableism. Consistent with my assessment of the pervasive deficit discourses about disability, Dobbs contended that disability is textually presented as a state of less than, rather than a dynamic continuum that is shifting and contingent, imbued with personal, social, historical, economic, and political meaning, conceptualized through multiple lenses. Disability as less than is therefore a prominent discourse in music education. Moreover, the majority of studies analyzed privileged medical model thinking about disability, an approach to disability rooted in deficit and remedy. Dobbs, Rathgeber, and Bell are currently working to analyze any discursive changes over the last 12 years since Dobbs' 2012 publication. If music education still relies on ideas that disability is an embodied functional deficit in the context of an overarching hegemony of normativity inscribed via systemic ableism, then music education itself participates in the negative socialization process about disability. In its current state, the music education default on disability is deficit and exclusion, leaving no room for unruly bodies and minds at the center of music education. As a relatively small field, however, we perhaps have the opportunity to unsettle these prominent discourses and socialization processes in ways that might potentially make a difference. What difference might it make, for example, if unruly bodies and minds were a routine part of everyday life, including in music education? Instead of practicing exclusion, or, at best, marginalization, what might it mean to work against the discourses Dobbs revealed? What would it mean to make room for unruly bodies and minds at the absolute center of the field? While the margins, as Hooks notes, are a site of radical possibility, what changes when we orient our praxis from the perspectives of those previously pushed to paraphractic, that is marginal while also hypervisible, space? Despite the prevalence of disability in the population, disability is still not necessarily a daily encounter due to at least two factors. In schools, students with disabilities are often segregated in special education spaces, despite identified intentions about mainstreaming and the least restrictive environment called for by the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, in the US. In segregated contexts, however, encounters between populations occur far less frequently. So practices of both exclusion and segregation in schools may limit the possibilities to disrupt discourse around disability for both disabled and non-disabled students. In employment, the poor employment rate of disabled folks has been a long-standing problem. In 2022 in the US, 45% of individuals with a disability from ages 21 to 64 were employed. This chronic underemployment means that encountering disability in the workplace may not necessarily be an everyday occurrence. In considering ways to place unruly bodies and minds at the center of music education, this move potentially involves a radical shift from invisibility and minimal encounters to routine encounters, which may then work to dismantle and unsettle the patterns of socialization I have identified. Everyday encounters may then interrupt the barrage of negative imagery and messaging about disability for both disabled and non-disabled populations, and, moreover, may support political consciousness raising, centering and creating space for unruly bodies and body minds in society, education, and music education may enable a hyper-visibility on the terms of those of us who are disabled in a way that may prove productive in resisting the avalanche of negative imagery and messaging around disability. In making space for the unruly, music educators can also actively work against the ideas of the normative and the normate. Garland Thompson clarifies the term normate usefully designates the social figure through which people can represent themselves as definitive human beings. Normate, then, is the constructed identity of those who, by way of the bodily configurations and cultural capital they assume, can step into a position of authority and wield the power it grants them. The normate, then, is a fundamental tool of the dehumanization of the other, as it relies on the hierarchies of the human. The presence and operation of hierarchies of the human has been well established in music education in regards to race. Music educators can consider the embedding of these hierarchies in relation to all minoritized identities, including that of disability. In centering the unruly, then, music educators can actively oppose notions of the normate and the normative that position bodies with dominant identities at the top of the hierarchy by engaging in critical conversations with children and youth that center a humanizing approach to all bodies and work against dehumanization, either explicitly or implicitly, depending on student age. Carla Shalaby's work, for example, provides a beautiful example of ways to work with young children in ways that validate their experiences and their humanity and center feelings of safety. For Shalaby, it is imperative that young people feel free from any kind of harm or persecution across the full range of identities. This humanizing approach to teaching can well occur in music education and can unsettle both ideas of the normate and normative ways of being, as well as any reinscribing of long-standing hierarchies of the human that promote dehumanization and oppression. In considering what it might mean to cultivate a humanizing music education that eschews any reinscription or reinforcement of hierarchies of the human long present in the field, I now turn to philosopher Martin Buber. Buber theorizes two kinds of relations, I-thou and I-it. While I-thou describes a relation between a person and another being, I-it is the relation of subject to object. I-it relations, however, can also include relationships with other beings. Rather than being understood as fellow beings, though, an I-it relationship reduces the other human to object status. Given the significant overrepresentation of negative imagery and messages surrounding disability, society perhaps has a tendency toward considering disability in terms of I-it relations. This tendency, moreover, becomes exacerbated in the context of the prevalence of the medical model, which reduces disability to a problem to be fixed, rather than a human with whom to be in relationship. I suggest instead that music educators, and indeed educators, can work to cultivate I-thou relationships in our classrooms that resist any tendency toward I-it understandings of the so-called other. I-thou relations require not only recognizing the humanity of all in our relationships, but also the embrace of the complex and messy ways that our humanity shows up in different spaces, including in the context of music education. If our societal socialization around disability and medicalized approach to it encourages I-it relations, then music education perhaps presents an opportunity to remake those relations and create spaces in which children and youth may bring their unique and complex lives alongside all of their intersecting identities to school. Moreover, in inviting young people to bring their full selves to the classroom, we might consider the ways that educators can do the same. Disability, in its unruliness and what Campbell refers to as its uncontainability, might offer a path toward ways that all participants in music education can bring our messy selves to the classroom and expect to be received by others as a thou in an I-thou relationship. The theme of this conference is embracing the messy. As music educators, let us center the unruly and the messy. Centering I-thou relations in this way may do a great deal toward interrupting the pervasive ableist discourses to come to new ways of thinking about disability. Given the challenges that processes such as integration as well as compliance-based segregated spaces present to political consciousness raising about disability, specifically among disabled folks, music educators might also consider the ways that music education might support political conscious raising. Elsewhere, I have theorized what I call a pedagogy of noticing for music education, which facilitates children and youth to notice the ideologies that are circulating around them, understand the conditions that shaped their lived experiences, and move to action. In the case of disability, noticing ideologies involves understanding the different processes and factors involved in socialization as described above, as well as considering the ways that these processes and factors shape our experiences and the conditions in our lives. Having explicit discussions in music education about how socialization operates makes disabled and non-disabled students alike far less likely to internalize these discourses and subject themselves to unchecked ableism. Engaging a pedagogy of noticing for disability alongside other forms and systems of oppression allows students to notice the ideologies circulating to then make their own decisions. The opposition to activism and political consciousness raising has always relied on separation, making us all believe that others are different from us and therefore not united in the same struggle. Processes of exclusion, including those that occur in schools and in music education in relation to disability, act to separate disabled and non-disabled students from one another, as well as separate disabled students from forming a unit. Helping children and youth recognize both the ideologies that are circulating as well as the tactics of separation may then contribute to not only resistance to ableism and its internalization, but also support activism related to disability and disabled and mad people beyond the bounds of school. Understanding that we, as humans, are all in this world together rather than separated into factions may go a long way to unsettling ableism alongside other forms of oppression. Music educators might also consider ways to center disability counterstories in music education. As noted above, Campbell observes that most success stories related to disability involve narratives of success in spite of impairment rather than success because of disability, or, as I have added, with disability or and disability. Indeed, Campbell suggests centering the counter stories, narratives that unsettle the in spite of impairment pattern. Music educators have a unique opportunity to center voices of our own choosing in music education. I offer an example. What might it mean to center the artistic work of artists, musicians like Leroy Moore Jr. or Molly Joyce, disabled folks who have cultivated an impressive platform? Moore founded Crip Hop Nation, a movement that encourages the use of hip hop to explore and express experiences of disability and centers the music and artistic practices of disabled artists. Joyce is a composer and performer who performs on a vintage toy organ that she found to be perfect for her body. Like Moore, she has created space for other disabled artists. Encounters with disability are perhaps not unusual in music class. Beethoven's deafness, for example, is often deemed worthy of discussion. The typical narrative, however, is one of success in spite of impairment. Centering voices like Leroy Moore and Molly Joyce in the classroom present opportunities for other kinds of narratives about disability, ones that confound and interrupt the common representations that pervade the popular sphere. Unsettling these dominant narratives and highlighting counter stories may ultimately disrupt the ableist discourses that have been so widely internalized by disabled and non-disabled folks alike. Taken together, these strategies for music education work to unsettle the pervasive ableism in both society in general and in music education, and thereby also resist its internalization among students and educators. Given the inevitability of disability, finding tangible ways to interrupt ableism in and through music education becomes imperative to unsettling the oppressive types of representations and narratives that so widely influence our societal perspectives on disability, including how we may come to feel about ourselves upon becoming disabled. I am deeply unsettled by the tape playing in my head about my body and would not wish this kind of internalized oppression on anyone. Given my current role in music education, I offer these possibilities for pedagogy in the hopes that such ableist discourse can be disrupted before it is internalized. Given the pervasiveness of ableism in society, and also in education and music education, mobilizing against it becomes important. Activism against ableism works to address the external manifestations of ableism in ways that include what I laid out for music education. It is my hope that this kind of activist effort may also impact the internal discourse, the how we talk to ourselves as disabled people. When we collectively interrupt the pervasive ableism operating in representation and discourse as a form of oppression and injustice, this interruption creates the possibility of internal impact as well. When, as disabled and mad folks, we refuse to conform and be contained, we disrupt the normative standards for body minds, instead celebrating our unruliness and uncontainability. In doing so, we offer new and contested representations of disability and madness in the public sphere that interrupt the dominant narratives that contribute to the socialization processes I described. Campbell put forward the importance of counterstory related to disability. She also had another suggestion. The second images of disabled people engaged in guerrilla activity, rejecting the promises of liberalism and looking elsewhere, daring to think in alternative ways about impairment. She concludes with Hooke's assertion of the margin as a site of radical possibility, a space of resistance. I wish to quiet the voice in my head that has been so well socialized to understand my body as less than. In order to do so, we must collectively dare to think in alternative ways about impairment, to not be constrained by problematic representations or neoliberalism, or biopolitics, or eugenics. External forces that deeply impact music education. Interruption of such discourses and movements is essential to both interrupting the pervasive ableism in society, but also refusing the possibility that our unruly body minds might somehow understand ourselves as less than. Music education can play a role in this work, both in the ways that I have outlined and in other ways that I have yet to imagine. Disability is central to any and all discussions of equity. In purposefully centering it, I believe that together we can mobilize against the ableism at the ready and unsettle oppressive discourses, narratives, representations, and policies to move toward guerrilla activity related to disability and music education while simultaneously valuing people for who we are rather than what we produce. I would like to now invite people in attendance to be in conversation about this topic. I am sorry that I can't be with you for one of my favorite music education events. I hope that it's a rich and fruitful conference, and I appreciate this opportunity to be able to participate in this way.